guys, welcome back to our 6th episode in this genetic series. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, please make sure to take a look by clicking the button. I still haven't worked out where it goes, somewhere on this screen. Click that out for the whole playlist of our genetic series and have a watch of the others in the series before this one. Today we're looking at acts like super and allelic genes. So we're looking at what do we mean by acts like super, what do we mean by allelic, and how does it all work? Let's get started. So today we're going to look at what we mean by ALS, or what that stands for is acts like super, or alternatively, we talk about animals being allelic. And so what does that actually mean? Now, straight away, we have looked at what we mean by a super animal, okay, where every offspring carries the gene if it breeds to a normal. But we've also looked at the term allele, which is linked to this term here, allelic. Now, a good example, so it's probably easiest to show an example and then work backwards from that animal. So here we have a crystal ball python. Now, a crystal is a combination of two different genes. It's a combination of the Mojave gene and it's a combination of the special gene. And when you put those two genes together into an animal, or when you breed a Mojave animal to a special animal, you can produce a crystal. And this animal here is an allelic animal, or it's an act like super animal. So what does that actually mean? What does that mean? What's the difference between this combination right here as opposed to, let's say, a pastel Mojave or a pastave? Why is this combination here really special? And why are things like the blue-eyed leucistics, the bells as they're known as, why are they also allelic, and why are they referred to as act like super? And we're going to have a look at that now. So when it comes to animals which are allelic, they have inherited, in this case, let's say we produce or we breed a female Mojave, or we're going to female Mojave, and we're going to say that's a codominant mutation, right? So capital M, and the other one would be normal because it's a single gene Mojave. And we breed a normal Mojave to a special male, okay? And again, special is an incomplete dominant mutation, so SN. And if we do our little Punnett square, we will find that MS, SN, N, M, and then normal. So on average here, we are looking at 20 or 50%, 25% of the animals will be normal. 25% will be Mojave. 25% will be special. And then finally, 25% here will be Mojave special, which is called a crystal ball python. Now you notice for the first time in this series, we have put two different genes in our Punnett square. Now normally you cannot do this because each gene or each code would have to sit on a different allele. But actually, Mojave and special are alleles of the same gene, and that's why this works. So if we go back to our diagram of the DNA or the double helix, the double helix, obviously you inherit one from one parent, one from another. Now, we said in our first video that an allele is a variation or different version of the same gene. And that's very important here. So when you look at on the DNA, when you look at on the location of the DNA, let's say this location here, that there is where the gene for Mojave sits. It's also the same place where special sits, phantom, lesser, butter, Russo, and there are some others in that complex. This is what we call the Bell complex. And basically, what that means is all of these different genes here are actually variations or different versions of the same gene. Which means when you combine two or more of these, you produce an ALS, acts like super, or allelic animal. And what that means is if you have a Mojave, so we looked at a Mojave special or a crystal, its genes are MS. So when it inherits, when it has offspring, if you bred it to a normal, it could pass on either the Mojave gene or the special gene. It cannot pass on a normal gene, nor can it pass on both Mojave and special. So a crystal could never recreate itself if bred to a normal. You could never produce another Mojave special if you breed it to a normal, which is not true for different genes which are non-allelic. So for example, if you look at a firefly, which is a fire pastel, it could in fact, if you breed a firefly to a normal, it could in fact produce a firefly. But that's because fire and pastel would sit, so if we use this example here, we could say fire sits here, pastel sits there. So they're different genes entirely. They are not allelic, they are not different versions of each other. They are in fact different genes entirely. Whereas with the acts like super, they exist on the same allele. Just like if you bred for example, a phantom to a Mojave, okay? So if you had a phantom Mojave, that would be called a purple passion, which genetically, if we say P for phantom, M for Mojave, a purple passion can never recreate itself. It could pass on the Mojave gene or it could pass on the phantom gene. So on average, half of its offspring will be phantom and half of its offsprings would be Mojave. That's also the sort of the blue-eyed Lucies or the blue-eyed leucistic animals, which could be Mojave lesser, lesser butter, super lesser, etc. They're all still allelic or acts like super. So a super lesser would have the genotype LL. All of its hatchlings would be lesser. But if you had a lesser Mojave, so ML, half would be lesser, half would be Mojave, but there would be no normals because the parents must pass on one of those two genes on each allele, because they either have to pass on this copy of their DNA or they have to pass on that copy of their DNA. And where they sit on the same allele, right, they must pass on both. Now, another common example of acts like super mutations are the yellow belly complex animals. So again, if we go back to our DNA, on the same location, you have a number of genes which are allelic to each other. You have yellow belly, you have gravel, you have asphalt, you have spectre, you have spark, and there's a few others that I'm not going to go into here. But these are all of these genes are allelic to one another, okay? Which means they are variations of the same gene. They will all sit on this location, hypothetically, they will all sit on the same location of the DNA. And when, for example, you produce a highway, like this little girl right here, who's unfortunately in shed, she is an allelic animal. So she is a yellow belly gravel, okay? So her genotype is yellow belly gravel. we'll represent that as a capital Y, capital G. Remember, they are still codominant or incomplete dominant mutations. So she is an allelic animal. If she was to breed, half of her offspring would be gravel, or receive the gravel gene, and half of her offsprings would receive the yellow belly gene. Okay, but this is a complex which is very peculiar and very difficult to work with if you don't breed it to the correct animal. And that is because yellow belly and gravel on their own visually look the same. So you can't identify from a normal yellow belly looking animal whether it is a yellow belly or a gravel or an asphalt or a spectre or a spark, for example, which is why quite commonly you will see animals for sale that say yellow belly / gravel. Okay, and this here is because there is no way to determine. So if this girl was to breed to a normal, all of her babies will have to inherit either the yellow belly gene or the gravel gene. But visually, there is no way of telling a yellow belly apart from a gravel. So all the babies are labeled as yellow belly / gravel because there is no way of knowing which is which. So we know for sure it's one of these two because it acts like a super. It must pass on one of the genes, but on its own, there's no way of visually seeing it. The only way of being absolutely certain of what they are in this complex would be to breed one acts like super, so one allelic animal, to another allelic animal. So a good example of this, if I bring this little lady here, if we were to breed this female yellow belly gravel or a highway, okay, if we were to breed her to, let's say, a male ivory, and now an ivory is a super yellow belly, so it's got two copies of the it's got two copies of the yellow belly gene. If I was to breed these two animals together and we look at the Punnett square quick, so here's our quick Punnett square, Y, G, Y, Y, then if we calculate that, here we would have Y, Y, here we'd have Y, G, here we would have Y, Y, and here we would have Y, G. And you'll see that 50% of those offsprings produced from this pairing, so if we do these 50%, they will be ivories. So 50% will be Y, Y, homozygous. And we notice that an ivory is a super yellow belly, so it would be an all-white snake. Whereas the other 50% here would be yellow belly gravel, which is highway. So the other 50% would be Y, G, which are highways. And that is how acts like super or allelic work in terms of breeding, why they what it actually means. So you have an animal with two genes that exist on the same allele. Why an allelic animal can't recreate itself, because it must pass on one but cannot pass on both of the genes because they're sitting on the same spot. So in this case, let's say this highway girl, she may have yellow belly here, and on the same location on this side she would have gravel. Okay, so she has to pass, Y, she would have to pass on one of them, but she cannot pass on both. And hopefully you understand then why, for example, certain things like the yellow belly complex animals, why you sometimes find animals for sale that are yellow belly / gravel. You also see yellow belly / asphalt, etc. Because unless they are bred to another acts like super, when you hit a yellow belly looking animal, in this case, there is no way of telling them apart. Hopefully guys, that episode really helped you understand a little bit more about acts like super, a little bit more like about allelic. Why do we call them these things? Why is it that we can't recreate a crystal ball python from a pairing between a crystal and a normal? So hopefully that's really helped you guys out. Help us out by hitting that like and subscribe button. Leave a comment down in the comment section below. And until the next episode, guys, we'll see you then. Bye.